For decades, Bob Duggar had cultivated an image of total control over his family, the public discourse, and most significantly every dollar that passed through the Duggar business. He oversaw everything, including book deals, television contracts, and public appearances. Growing up, Jill and Jinger had been taught that this was the standard, and that their father's control over the family's money was just a part of the unwritten rules they had to follow. However, as they grew older, the delusion started to fall apart. When she inquired about money from the early seasons of the family program, Jill became the first to notice it. She recalled working long hours, doing interviews, taking part in advertising photos, and arranging her life to suit the demands of the production, but she never received a check. When she mentioned it in passing at a family gathering, Bob smiled rehearsely, brushing off her worry and repeating the same line he had been using for years. The money was being handled carefully, and everything was done for the family's benefit. Jill accepted that response for a long time, until she discovered that the businesses continued to grow, the family complex continued to expand, and the finances continued to be hidden from everyone but Bob. Around the same time, Jinger began to have her misgivings, although she never publicly expressed them. After she and Jeremy relocated to Los Angeles, she began observing how other families functioned. She observed people who understood their contracts, couples who talked openly about money, and women who knew exactly how much they were getting paid for their labor. It was a startling contrast. She came to the realization that she had never fully comprehended her role in a massive business. The same response she got from Jill when she subtly mentioned to Bob that she wanted access to her own money was that everything was being managed for her safety. She had been trained to laud that term protection, but it began to feel more like a prison. Although neither sister realized the other was going through the same gradual awakening, they both sensed the change. Jill started taking notes, noting dates, contracts she faintly recalled signing, and schedules for filming in which she had taken part. She only needed clarity. She had no idea what she was intending. The family's tension increased as Derek began to ask forthright questions. They were accused of being disrespectful, disobedient, and ungrateful to the man who had supposedly given up all for them. The questions were heavier than the guilt. Jinger, meanwhile, started discreetly learning about her legal rights. She gained knowledge of performance contracts, residuals, intellectual property, and likeness rights. She gained enough knowledge to realize that the way everything had been handled was seriously flawed. She watched, listened, and got ready before confronting anyone. She and Jeremy talked about their future, and came to the realization that they would need to financially separate from the Duggar system, if they ever wished to achieve true freedom. Long before either daughter spoke out loud, Bob could feel the change. He observed Jill's hesitation when discussing family projects. He observed Jinger's more controlled reactions and the way she refrained from taking on new filming responsibilities before consulting her calendar. Because independence meant losing control, and losing control meant losing the empire he had painstakingly built, freedom was a threat to him. When Jill asked for copies of previous contracts, the first significant crack formed. She didn't back down when Bob dismissed her again. With a confidence he wasn't used to seeing in her, she inquired quietly, again, and with assurance. Miles away, Jinger was formulating her own plan, learning new things every week, and researching how big family brands occasionally operated as closed systems with money going to a single central authority. She understood how softly things could go wrong in the absence of transparency. Unbeknownst to them, the two sisters were traveling simultaneously. Their separate hardships had not yet come together to form the cohesive force that would eventually threaten their father's whole financial system. However, the change was taking place quietly and gradually, much like the start of a checkmate that the king is unaware of until it is too late. The pivotal moment started subtly, almost by mistake, when Jill was going through storage bins at home when she came across a packet of old documents. Schedules, signing forms, and a few stray pages from early filming agreements were all photocopied within. She couldn't understand most of it, but one line, a portion stating the cast members' specific salary rates, caught her eye. After a long moment of staring at the numbers, she realized that she had never seen numbers that high associated with her name. Although the finding wasn't conclusive, it was sufficient to validate her long-standing assumption that funds were moved to a location she was never permitted to see. Derek grasped the ramifications as soon as she showed him the papers. He urged her to quit accepting half-baked solutions, to ask more questions and to keep searching. Something inside of Jill finally changed. She had always been conflict-averse and had been trained to keep things harmonious at all costs. She came to the realization that she scared confrontation less than she desired clarity. Jinger, meanwhile, was confronted with her own epiphany. She was discussing her book ideas with a publisher in Los Angeles when she was asked a straightforward question that left her speechless. Did she have access to her own rights and profits from prior media projects? She was unsure of how to react. There was more to the room's quiet than could be explained. She came to the realization that she had participated in a media empire all her life without knowing anything about the financial or legal framework that underpinned it. She was shocked at the resolve that was sown in her by that moment. After learning how unfair the arrangement with her family had been, she started reading as much as she could about contracts and creative rights. Before taking on any new public job, Jeremy encouraged her to create her own ownership and to continue learning. Bob noticed a change in the family dynamic back in Arkansas. He had become used to unquestioning allegiance, to being the only person who could comprehend financial affairs, and to upholding a system that directed all revenue through avenues under his control. He saw any call for openness as a challenge or an allegation, and he didn't like challenges. He started convening family gatherings more frequently and emphasized thankfulness, loyalty, and unity. He talked about staying away from worldly influence and preserving the family legacy. Although he spoke in a calm tone, there was a warning below. With renewed determination, Jill went to one of those gatherings. She posed a direct question in front of everyone during Bob's customary lecture about family duties. Where was the money from the early years of filming, and why hadn't any of the adult children received their share? There was silence in the room. In response, Bob gave his well-known justifications of family spending, group income, and the expenses of managing a large home. However, Jill persisted this time. She requested reports, figures, and any other documentation demonstrating the management of the monies. The conference ended quickly with unfulfilled promises as the tension in the room increased. Jinger was facing her own kind of pushback across the nation. Bob reminded her that everything had always been done to safeguard her, and urged her to exercise patience when she requested copies of previous contracts. He presented independence as risky and unnecessary. Jinger saw the trend and understood that the lack of openness was deliberate, rather than coincidental. She made the decision to stop depending on assurances. She was looking for proof, not certainty. The sisters had yet to have direct conversations regarding these matters. They had been raised in a society that prohibited talking about money, particularly anything that would challenge authority. However, Jill's annoyance was becoming too much to handle. A close friend to whom she confided urged her to never stop asking questions. When Jinger started talking more candidly about her prior experiences with trusted individuals outside of her family, she discovered that she wasn't just dreaming. Others could also see the parallels. Bob began to tighten his hold as he felt the pressure. His veiled remarks suggested that his girls were being influenced by persons outside the family, and that their independence was a sign of drift rather than maturity. He sounded as though allegiance was eroding and needed to be restored. However, Jill and Jinger were increasingly aware of how much they had been kept in the dark, as he attempted to exert greater control. The two sisters' parallel paths were gradually coming into alignment. Jinger was learning and becoming more self-assured while Jill was gathering proof piece by piece. Although the two paths had not yet met, they were gradually approaching the point at which their common experiences would come together to form a single realization. The financial truth had been concealed, and by coming to light together, everything would be different, not only for them but for the entire Duggar empire. Since they had been asking questions on their own for so long, neither Jill nor Jinger anticipated that their paths would eventually intersect. Jill called Jinger to see how she was doing after learning that she was working on a new book project. And that's when it occurred. The informal tone of the talk quickly changed. Expecting merely kind pity, Jill voiced her worries about previous contracts. However, she was met with a prolonged silence until Jinger acknowledged that she had been asking the same questions. Everything changed in that instant. They found how comparable their hardships had been when they directly compared their experiences for the first time. Jinger described not being able to access documents and hearing the same prepared lines. Jill discussed missing payments and Bob's evasive justifications. They understood that it was all no accident. There was a pattern. Knowing she wasn't alone gave Jill a sense of relief. Knowing that her intuition was right gave Jinger a sense of validation. They came to the consensus that they required clarity, actual clarity, not just assurances. They committed to disclosing all of their material, including emails, incomplete documents, and recollections of talks with their father. Although it was the start of a strategy, it was not yet a plot of insurrection. Bob was unaware that this chat was happening. The cornerstone of his financial control began to erode as the two girls he had always assumed would remain silently faithful began to compare truths for the first time. The picture became more apparent than either Jill or Jinger had anticipated once they started exchanging information. Jill had direct recollections of unpaid labor and pieces of old papers. Jinger had research, legal counsel from contacts in Los Angeles, and an increasing awareness of the typical workings of family-controlled media contracts. They saw the entire structure of the system they had grown up in when they put everything together. It was planned, methodical, and based only on Bob's power. They talked about actually doing something for the first time. Jill recommended asking directly for a thorough financial breakdown, preferably in writing. Jinger concurred, but suggested that they make the request jointly. She was aware that Bob frequently used emotional isolation to deal with personal issues, but it would be more difficult to ignore two girls at once. Neither of them backed down after discussing the dangers, potential criticism, and charges they may encounter. Transparency was a fundamental right they had never been granted, and they both realized that it was not revolt. The following step was straightforward but effective. They each precisely outlined their questions in writing. Simple requests without emotion or accusations. Jill requested copies of her individual earnings, payment records, and contracts. Jinger made the same request, adding inquiries concerning revenues and long-term rights. To make sure nothing sounded ambiguous or contrite, they discussed their manuscripts with one another. Bob's initial reaction to the messages was one of bewilderment, followed by disappointment, and then subtly cautioning against external influences and spiritual values. However, the sisters quietly responded, restating the same requests without getting into heated disputes. It was the first time he became aware of their coordination and realized that the outdated control techniques were no longer effective. Unexpectedly, as the strain increased, other siblings started to notice the change. Jill was seen standing firmly. They observed Jinger asking candid inquiries. They sensed a shift in the mood, and the family's stillness began to crack, despite the fact that no one else had joined them yet. Although Jill and Jinger had not yet directly faced an empire, they had already taken the most crucial step. They had united their voices. Additionally, Bob was no longer dealing with his girls one at a time for the first time in their lives. The quiet conflict in the family became something more profound and long-lasting when Jill and Jinger persisted in demanding openness. Bob was used to problems being resolved fast, usually following heartfelt discussions, calls for family harmony, or reminders of one's spiritual obligations. However, nothing worked this time. Jill and Jinger politely requested clarification each time he gave evasive answers. They redirected each time he deflected. They remained calm each time he issued a warning. Since the sisters were now thinking strategically rather than reacting emotionally, the power he had depended on for years was eroding. Bob was unaware that Jill and Jinger were receiving outside assistance. In addition to talking to financial consultants, Jill and Derek were getting ready to write down what they had gone through. In Los Angeles, Jinger and Jeremy were discreetly speaking with industry professionals to find out how family media companies generally manage children's earnings and how unique their circumstances were. They learned quietly but effectively. The basis of Bob's system appeared increasingly precarious with each piece of information they acquired. When Jill eventually obtained some of the documentation she had asked for, it was a turning moment. There were enough hints to prove that substantial sums of money had moved through the Duggar brand without the kids ever seeing their part, even if the documents were incomplete and lacking critical information. Jill had thought she was dreaming or forgetting for years, but seeing half-formed figures in black ink dispelled all doubt. Responses to Jinger were also insufficient, and the trend was unavoidable. They came to see that they were dealing with a system that was intended to keep them ignorant, not with misconceptions. The sisters utilized the knowledge to strengthen their independence, rather than confronting him in a hostile manner. Jill made the decision to talk about her experiences in public, using her calm, straightforward voice, rather than a dramatic outburst of disobedience. She described how having financial control had impacted her marriage, her life, and her sense of independence. Her remarks struck a chord with individuals outside of the Duggar fandom. Public pressure changed the narrative entirely, and support for her bravery poured in. Jim Bob had always depended on the family's tidy, cohesive image, but now one of the most dependable daughters was speaking up, and the world was paying attention. Jinger took another route. At first, she refrained from publicly confronting the situation. Rather, she demonstrated a different side of herself, one that was self-reliant, considerate, and financially savvy. By using her position, she described how she had abandoned traditional systems and taken charge of her own life in her book and interviews. Although she wasn't making any explicit accusations, it was obvious that she had left a system that no longer worked for her. Her poised, well-spoken message resonated with viewers who had never heard of the Duggar family before, and her development rendered Jim Bob's previous story seem archaic and lacking. Their combined voices created a force that Jim Bob's kingdom was never intended to withstand. For many years, his power rested on total allegiance and quiet. However, the two girls he had previously assumed would continue to be obedient were suddenly influencing the public discourse. Jill presented the facts. Jinger added nuance. Furthermore, the combination made it impossible for the original structure to remain unaltered. It had a silent financial consequence. Companies no longer felt at ease partnering with a family that was being questioned about their transparency. Networks re-examined their collaborations. Once flowing easily through Jim Bob, business prospects now slowed or vanished completely. The weight of honesty started to bring down the empire that had been sustained by secrecy. Concurrently, Jill and Jinger's individual autonomy flourished. Jill reinforced her life outside of the family dynamic, started her own enterprises, and created her own sources of money. Jinger carried on producing content, writing, and creating possibilities under her complete authority. Even when detractors attempted to split them, they remained united, encouraged one another's development, and took inspiration from one another. The actual checkmate wasn't loud or dramatic in the end. Neither a confrontation nor a collapse occurred all at once. It was the gradual recognition by the public, the siblings, and eventually Jim Bob himself that the authority he had previously possessed had changed irrevocably. Jill and Jinger dismantled his empire with clarity, intelligence, and independence rather than with rage. They demonstrated that the power of truth outweighs the delusion of control by building their own lives with openness and purpose. Jim Bob has always thought he could control things indefinitely. However, he failed to recognize the influence of two girls who subtly choose integrity above conformity. The last move had already been made when he became aware that the board had altered. The voices he taught to speak, but never imagined would speak for themselves, overtook the empire he established on quiet. And instead of being a part of someone else's system, Jill and Jinger took the next step toward their own destiny as the creators of their own identities, careers, and financial independence. The tale that started out as silent inquiries culminated in a total metamorphosis. They did more than simply break away from the previous system. They replaced it with something much more powerful. An empire founded on independence rather than subservience, a life they controlled, and a voice they owned.